From 1980 to 2000, I produced and hosted a communications magazine on Radio Netherlands, the Dutch international broadcasting service. We made over 1,000 editions of Media Network, and just over half still survive. Since then, I've travelled the world several times in search of the stories of what made shortwave international broadcasting such a fascinating place to be towards the end of the 20th century. But this time, we took a camera on the safari. At the start of January 2017, in the first days of the Trump presidency, I visited Potomac, Maryland, a town on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. I was invited into the home of Dan Robinson, someone who built a career of 34 years working as a journalist at the Voice of America. But as well as being a well-known broadcaster, especially to audiences in Africa, he also contributed news and tips to the Media Network program in the 1980s. Dan has always had a passion for radios, and with each set comes a story. So it was a delight when he agreed to share some of his recollections about the rise and fall of the Voice of America. He started by showing me around his unique radio collection.
We're in the den here in my home in Potomac, Maryland. Lived here about 10 or 11 years with my wife, Harriet. This room kind of represents a lot of my life. We kind of combined our lives at a point, and I've got representations of my travels and my radio hobby in here. Over here is what I call the Thai chest, which contains a lot of the souvenirs, I guess you say, from Southeast Asia mostly, some from Africa actually. Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Indonesia, Burma here on the top. And I kind of keep this on hand to show people when they come by.
And where were you actually stationed?
In the 1980s, I was stationed in Nairobi, Kenya, for Voice of America. I was East Africa correspondent, but did a lot of traveling in East and Central and occasionally in the West. And then, as this chest demonstrates, I was in Asia for actually 5 years, from 1991 to 96, based in Bangkok, but with responsibilities that went all over the region. As over to Burma and then down to Indonesia, East Timor, Vietnam. Spent quite a bit of traveling time in Vietnam at a time when Vietnam was, just opening up, leading to the normalization of relations, easing of relations with Bill Clinton in the 90s. So those are the two overseas experiences I had as a VOA correspondent. At the end of my career in 2014, after 34 years, they gave me a plaque here, which many people get, and it's got the Career Achievement Award, and down here, 33, it says 33 years of government service. So it was a good, rewarding career. Did a lot of things that many people would, kill to be able to do, and I'm grateful for that. And a lot of things that any shortwave young kid involved in the shortwave radio hobby could never have imagined at the time.
When did you first start listening?
First started listening. This is a tough one because my first experience I remember listening was on an old Blaupunkt family radio with the map and all the city names on it, and with those giant ivory keys. I think they were ivory still at the time. And I used to do that in my aunt's house in Philadelphia, but soon after that, I was in New York City in the Bronx, where my father's mother, went down in the basement, and he actually found the radio, which is up there on the top. It's a pilot radio, I think circa 1938 to 1942, maybe a little later than that. It's the one with the big tuning eye. I don't know if you can see that. It's got the big tuning eye on the top.
And that was basically a tube which sort of lit up and...
Signal level.
It's showing you signal level.
Signal level, and I used to actually have my my ear, because I didn't at that point understand how to connect radios up with cables. I had my ear up to that speaker, listening to all kinds of stations at all hours of the day. I will say this: at that point, our favorite station, even then, this is the late '60s, was Radio Tahiti, which you could actually hear. And I used to stay up until 2 or 3 a.m. listening to Radio Tahiti on that show, on that radio receiver.
And what made you curious? I mean, why? I mean, most people don't listen to shortwave.
Yeah, I think like many, kids who get turned on or got turned on to shortwave broadcast, it's that first spark of recognition that wherever you are or happen to be located, the first spark of recognition that there were these voices at any point, these places and countries and people trying to reach out to you for whatever reason, and for the local stations not necessarily trying to reach out to you, but broadcasting to their local people, but just by the by, you were able to hear them. And
you could overhear conversations which, because this is all pre-internet, I mean, there's no other way of hearing them.
Yeah, that's right. Pre-internet, I often, say these days, I think you'll agree that, what we have now in 2017 is, we have with Facebook and websites, Twitter and all that is actually the extremely accelerated, modernized version of shortwave radio, or if you were a ham radio operator. I mean, I often equate that computer base that I have here and in other parts of this house with like a ham radio setup or a shortwave listener setup. And of course, there's another radio up there. During this tour, you'll find quite a few radios.
What's this one?
This is a Stromberg Carlson AWP8.
Right.
And this is one of the what we call knockoffs of the Zenith Transoceanic.
Right.
But this was one of the most beautiful ones. If I could lift my arm, I have problems with my arm, but which came complete with thermometer and barometer inside, and it's still very valuable in the used market. Ones in this condition can go for as much as $400 to $500. One tucked behind here, which doesn't get its cover taken off very frequently, but I'll move. This is one of the most valuable on the collector's market still, which is the Sony 330K. And this is even more special because this is one of the rare ones that came with the LCD clock in it instead of the old motorized drum clock. These were masters of technology, examples of technology when Sony made them. Arguably, if you were trying to manufacture this these days, it would cost upwards of $10,000 or $15,000.
And they were made mainly for the maritime market, weren't they?
Yeah, I think they were
found on the yachts of the rich and famous.
Made for the rich and famous. This one, as you know, has the slide-out Sony cassette recorder, which they put in the bottom. And there are Yahoo Internet groups now. In fact, I run one. Which which cater to people who collect these and are desperately trying to keep them going and find parts.
Okay.
So that's the one up here, but there are many more downstairs.
Okay, I'll follow you downstairs then.
Yeah. Put this back here. Okay. Put the cover on here. If you don't keep these things going, the volume gets scratchy.
Yes. Yeah.
In fact, you're reminding me I should be using this thing here more than I do. These, by the way, go in top condition. Let's say collector's condition, they'll go for as much as $1,500. Occasionally, they appear like new in box, and those really become astronomical in terms of price.
And where do you find them? eBay?
eBay mostly, yeah. There are collectors, today that they're collectors that don't even go on eBay, who will just sell to each other in premium markets with what are called premium receivers, of which I have quite a few downstairs. Of course, people ask, why do you have so many radios that do the same thing? And it's hard to explain, isn't it?
But they each have a story.
What's that?
Each have a story.
Yeah, each has a story. Each has its own way of putting its mechanical and electronic hands on the radio signals that still remain here in 2017. And the funny thing is, quite a few of the countries that we used to lust after in the 1960s and 70s are actually still on the air today. So that's
okay.
All right. Oh, I forgot one over here. I'll point this out. This is another example of Sony's mastery of the radio market.
Yes.
The Pro 80, which I got interested in using and having.
We don't want to set arbitrary deadlines.
Because they not only had shortwave, but also had the air bands as well.
That's right, with a little converter that pops on the antenna to shift the frequencies to use that way.
Yeah.
We go to shortwave. Let's see, what time would it be now? So we'll
Those are the things that clearly are
hit.
going to help.
It's about 2200.
Whereas propagation these days has not been great. 11676 Cuban frequency. Religious station, of course.
Yeah.
Often the only things you can hear these days. There's Cuba again right there. If we really try hard, maybe we'll get India. But again, in this part of the house, it's tough. Better to connect it up. See, down we have a Wellbrook loop antenna that's out in the back. In fact, let me show you that too before we go downstairs.
That comes from the UK, doesn't it?
UK shipped it here. I can't imagine what the post persons thought when they delivered the giant loop in the mail. But after years of using just wires, I decided to put that. I'll hold that in my pocket. After years of wires, I decided to go with the Wellbrook loop, and it's on a other UK-made Sky mast with a rotor, and it does work superbly. Usually find myself, let's say when local AM stations, because of propagation, are overloading the shortwave frequencies and producing images, I rotate it to null them out.
Because that's a magnetic loop, isn't it?
Magnetic loop, powered loop, and I know a lot of people are experimenting with these today, even in these waning days of shortwave, but yeah, it's changed my whole listening.
Brilliant.
And so here you go, that's what brings it all in, yeah. All right, let's take a walk down here. You gonna keep rolling?
Yeah.
So, if we get interrupted by my wife when she comes out, let's see if I have any other radios that are up here. No, sometimes it's hard to remember. Hold on. Watch your step.
Okay.
So, yeah, this is probably what a lot of people would describe as crazy these days, but this is what I call the main bank of radios. Let me put some light on that.
Lots of familiar radios.
Lots of familiar radios. The famous Drake R8A and JRC NRD 545. The old standard, these radios are becoming more popular these days because people are increasingly appreciating the quality of construction that went into them.
Yeah.
R1000, R2000. Another Sony, the 6800W, which has a reputation still today as one of the most sensitive receivers there was ever made. Well, let me start. Let's see. Here's the NRD 515 with its memory unit over here and an original speaker. These are various speakers that were made. This one you remember by Grove, called the SP200, I think it is, for signal processing. I'm sorry that beautiful radio is so far down there, but that's an R7A Drake. And there's another R7A right here. I'll turn this on just for the heck of it and give you a little audio. Let's see here. Let's do a little tune. I mean, most people when they see this, the first question they ask if they don't know about shortwave is, why do you have all these radios? And I point out to them, for example, that right there, for example, is All India Radio, still in 2017, coming in well, right here in Maryland. Below this is a what used to be made just for the CIA and other agencies is a Watkins Johnson 8718A MFP for the front key. What time is it? Oh, we got 5 minutes. Oh, we got 5 minutes.
Fine.
Well, I'll just tour you around, just so we can get a pre. One of the only HQ180s with a built-in LED readout through the front panel.
Because that was the big problem in the 80s.
Yeah.
You didn't know what frequency it was.
That's right. And there's another one up here, HQ180AX on the top. You recognize this one?
The Eddie Star.
This is a museum quality piece I got back in, I think it was 2002. And I never got it going until I just had it overhauled by a guy in New Jersey. So now it's completely up to standards, converted to US voltage. And of course that's the X version of the hammer one. Crazy, huh?
But nice.
CRF 160
Okay.
up on the top. HQ 110. This actually might be going to the SWL Fest. Beautiful, brand new, condition clock and meter. I actually got this just because I felt sorry for it. I had it overhauled and I'll probably resell it.
And what sort of prices do these radios fetch these days?
This is, this is about 140, 175 US, and it takes another 150 or whatever, maybe 200 to overhaul it. These are a little more, the Hammerlands.
But is it difficult to get to parts?
It's difficult to get tough to get the parts, but you can get the tubes. There's no problem getting the tubes. Some people buy them just to get, like this clock will be worth $150 on its own. So some people buy ones that are in really poor shape just to get the clock put in better condition ones that they have. Well, let's go back here where there'll be less noise. This is not a pretty room, but you just have to be patient. So here's another.
Okay.
Yeah, she can't hear us in here. So here's another stack.
Yeah.
Another SW6800W Sony here. This is the not plugged in. The famous JRC series of marine radios, the NRD93 with a scanning unit channel unit attached to it. And this one is an amazing piece actually, which I just got recently, is the SB310 Heath kit. And these were popular in the 1960s. These were kits, and you'd actually build these things. And they perform actually quite amazingly.
How would you calibrate them? They had crystal calibrators?
I was never a technical expert, so I never was able to work on these things myself. But this one, just as an example, let's see what the time is. Almost 2200.
Yeah.
So let's give you an example.
That's 2200 UTC.
It's 2200 UTC. We're going to put this, we're in AM. Just as an example, this is hooked up to the big Wellbrook antenna, but give me a second. It's still, this is a tube unit, so you have to give it some time. And, oh, you know what? I've disconnected the antenna. That's why we're not hearing anything. So that's the SB310. So we'll flip that one off.
Okay.
Another classic from Drake is right here, which was the SW8.
Yeah, I remember that one.
And we'll light her up. And so again, this is operating on the Wellbrook. Go back to AM. Well, there's a VOA frequency, but just to give an example, this is one of the most sensitive receivers, as you know, Jonathan, along with the R series in there. And let's say we'll just go to this one. This one received not only shortwave but AM as well, and FM and airband. So we'll go to FM. Now we'll go back to shortwave.
Station from the DC Metro.
There's AM.
University of Maryland University College.
And if I remember how to get there, hold on. Shortwave. So I get function. We'll go to, let's say, Brazil, 11780. And there's Brazil. Beautiful reception. There's Cuba. There's the interval signal of Cuba, very familiar to all of us. There you go. That brings back memories. Now we'll go down here and see if, usually right there, usually is Zanzibar up until about 20 seconds ago, but that station went off the air. Argentina is still present here, 11710. In the morning, this is North Korea. If we go down again to, let's say, we were there before. Let's try. I'm forgetting how to tune the SWA. Embarrassing. There's All India Radio 9445.
Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, was the chief guest of the ceremony.
Now, one of the things we all fear now is that with the closure of Radio Australia imminent, as of the time we're recording this, that we're also going to lose All India Radio, which has been a constant companion for many of us over the decades. And frankly, one of the reasons why a lot of us still have these radios. Down there is Greece, which went back on the air amazingly. When it was taken off, it was put back, and we also amazingly have Spain still on the air. And of course, this time of day, if I'm not mistaken, we can get the BBC, which may be coming from Ascension or from Singapore, I can't remember which. On the other, but however, I do not think that's BBC. I think that's another station at this point. We do have the Saudi Arabia right 11820. There's another Cuban frequency. There's a Saudi frequency 11915. So you can see we all, as you know, we have these numbers and frequencies in our heads, after years of doing this. And it's another station there. I can't quite recall the identity of that. So without embarrassing myself, behind this door are still more radios. This is an HQ 145, another Hammerland receiver. Here's RFB 65s. There are actually 3 of them in this house. It's an old Panasonic portable.
Yeah,
I can see you're laughing already. I have 3 SW55s, which are Sony Classic portable by Sony. Another Sony ICF 7700. A boxed Sony SW100S. Sony IR8, which has some limited shortwave frequencies. So this is kind of the portable stash. I also have a Grundig 500, Satellite 500 in there.
Do you have a 2010 or a 2002?
I had a 2010, but I sold the 2010. I do have an Eaton E1 still hanging around somewhere, which is pretty much unused.
Wow.
And this is an old classic TC-142, just to get in a plug for Sony's cassette recorders. Still new in the box. It was never used. And a couple of TC-150Bs, which are the old Sony beautiful. In fact, this tape recorder is the same mechanism and basically machine that's used in that CRF-330K that we saw earlier.
Can you take it off the shelf? Show me?
Sure. A little recorder?
Yeah, just show me.
So just to demonstrate how well these things were made, this is not actually the better one I have, but you can see the metal construction, the TC-150, and this is the same kind of tabs
Piano
that
keys.
used in the 330K. They basically took this mechanism, slid it in, designed it in the bottom of that radio, and Sony was amazing for doing things like that.
Oh, I have a competition.
Leave that up there. And let's see what else do we have here.
Do you have a favourite?
Of the small ones,
Yeah.
best portable, I think, in the small category
Yeah.
that was ever made, although it lacks some of the features, was as I said, the Panasonic RFB 65.
Yeah.
And its sensitivity was just unrivaled, I think, among these small portables. It was very basic, but excellent. Single sideband reception too. And this appeared on eBay one day a few weeks ago, and the seller said, you know, it's working, but it was obvious from the ad that it was new in box. So there you go. And went for about $120. And of course, the SW55, you can't, you know, it's hard to get these particular ones out, but there's not much you can say about that. And Sony, of course, shrunk all its technology from the 2010 into the SW100S, which is an amazing tour de force of technology.
Okay.
Hard to see all this, but as I said, it's HQ145, which was also overhauled. I'll turn it around for you. Yeah, that's a little hammer on HQ145. I mean, to imagine that these radios were selling for, in their day, they were $400, $500, $600, but to make anything like this these days would end up, you know, costing you zillions of dollars.
Is that were they made for the ham radio market or were they made for the military?
These are made for ham radio market, and on rare occasions these were adapted for military rack use. For example, I think I've seen one or two HQ180s that were actually used in rack. Of course, the more famous Hammerlands, the SP600 series especially, were definitely used for military purposes, just like the old Helicrafters were. But these are like little babies. I mean, when you see them, and you have to appreciate the design and the planning that went into manufacturing these things. They're just so fantastic.
Hang on, you're
Yep.
just going to bring the microphone. That's fine. That's fine.
Yeah. So anyway, that's not much room in there. There's a lot more in there I'd show you, but
Okay.
all right. There's a couple things out here. We might as well take advantage of. Let's watch your step.
Oh, the cover.
Yep, AOR 7030. This is something that's coming back to me because it's being fixed. Here's a, sorry to be so messy, Drake SPR4, one of the ones I started listening on.
Oh, right. Yes.
Classic radio, this one.
And crystal control, wasn't it?
Crystal Control, right. And down there is what they call the king of radios,
The RF 9000.
RF 9000, which is in the box, pretty much like new in box. And
And I remember doing a review of that, and that was simply this was simply to show what they could do, because it was actually probably nearer $9,000, wasn't it? It was a very expensive radio.
that's right. I think it was actually 4,000 to 5,000, or maybe 3,700, if I recall correctly. You'll see here in the corner I have two TIAC reel-to-reel machines.
Yeah.
I do digitization transfers for the remaining shortwave listeners who are still with us,
Right.
and who suddenly realize that they need to preserve, for them or for us, their old audio. And so I can transfer reel-to-reel to either cassette, mini disc, or even micro cassette, the Sony NT1 or 2, which I have two of here in the house. But yeah, this is kind of a pride and joy. Whether I'll keep it or sell it, I don't know at this point. But there are probably only a few hundred of these made, I think, by Panasonic.
Yeah.
This one is about 100 or 200 serial number. And I did bring this to one of the shortwave radio meets some years ago, and people were astounded to be able to.
Can you open the top?
Yeah, sure. You want to pause, or you
Yeah.
want to? Let me turn this audio down here.
Yeah.
Of course, it's good audio wallpaper for you. Let me get a more pleasant station here. Hold on. Let's go back to All India Radio. How about that? He says confidently. Ever have those moments when you forget how to tune a radio?
Yes.
I have a new appreciation for this thing, by the way.
The Drake? Yeah.
I love this thing.
I got one at home.
You, do you? Beautiful.
Beautiful sound.
Although what I'm doing now is I'm going to try to figure out how to tweak it because it's a little off frequency. So apparently I have to take the bottom off and hit the...
Yeah.
Hold on for a second. Here we go. Is that level okay?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so oh, here's a. I'm sorry to ignore this.
Turn it a little bit.
Ignore this one here. This you'll recognize as the famous Grundig 650 satellite, which I've had for many years. This one is in perfect condition too.
There's a story about that, but actually involving Radio Netherlands, because on that radio, it's a very complicated tuning system,
Yes.
and it's all dependent on a rubber band.
That's right. Yeah.
And if the rubber band goes, you can't tune it anymore.
That's right.
So I made that comment on air, on Media Network,
Yeah.
and they came back to me and said, well,
Replace it with something else.
no, they actually included a spare rubber band or in the package, and when they finally got rid of it, they had a brilliant idea. Because I think Eaton was coming out with their new sets. All right, so this was obsolete,
Right.
and I think they had about 1,000 units left in a warehouse somewhere in Germany.
Yeah. Yeah.
So somebody had a brilliant idea of saying, okay, we'll do the final gold edition. Right, and we've only got 1,000 left.
You have one of these?
No, I don't.
Yeah.
But I know how they did it, and they said, and they photocopied they had a technical service manual with it, and they put everything that, and also some tricks, because apparently there were some key combinations that if you put in, it will display the name of the engineer who built it.
Oh wow, I would like to know that. I mean, still one of the best audio you can hear from radio, along with the Set 600. All right, so let me since this is a rare item, let me show you this, because not many people get a chance to check these out. In this condition, as you can see, it's not the lightest. This is a converter for the R2000. So there you go, a little bit of radio history. Again, I got this not only in this box, but the actual original shipping box. You can see the serial number on this is 132. Right there. And this also came with all the original accessories, the plates, the stick-ons for the panel, and the manual. And everything was pretty much brand new.
Is it important to collectors?
Yes, very important, because if something is first, condition is the most important thing, but if you get the original materials for it, you're batting 1,000. You see how this is packed. This is the original cover of it. Let me just pop the handle up. This weighs 44 pounds. Let's see here. Okay.
Without batteries.
Without batteries. So, as I said, a little bit of history here. So I'm gonna lift it up here. By the way, in this box is a Raquel 6790. Oh Lord. Okay. Well, there's the Panasonic R9. Oh, let me catch my breath. RF9000. Let me know if I'm jiggling the mic. The two pop-up antennas. You can see how well this thing is made. Most of these that you see in the used market have damage on the side. This kind of vinyl dense material. This has no damage. It does have a little pinprick on the right side, but that's about it. And then when you carefully open that, you'll see the technology that went into these things. Powered on if we had more time. So as you said, Panasonic basically meant this as a technology showpiece. There's an enormous speaker in here, and it's got a subwoofer as well, controlled over here. Got selectivity positions, I believe there are 3. And it's basically like a home stereo piece. S meter here, frequency readout, S meters here, clock over here. And this enables you to have the radio itself turn on at various times of day with the scheduling here. You see, this is what they used to do. These things, this was brand new when I got it. The little thing magnetically clips on there. This is all metal construction for the earphones. And yeah, regular earphones and, they're all metal, like so.
Are the world times?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's got a little map here. It doesn't have any, does it display? I can't quite remember whether it displays the time, but I mean, everything about this exudes quality. I mean, you can just feel the way this thing is constructed. And on the back, if I lift this up again, I brought this to one of the SWL fests.
Right.
On the back, you can see this original earphone still untouched. AC and battery compartment. I forget how many batteries it takes. I think it's eight or something like that. And when you take this off, you can see the construction is like military, level by level, like this, with all the capacitors and components like this in the back of it. So this is like 1 in a million. I very much doubt that there is one that I know of, which was sold unopened in a box about 2 years ago, and it brought initially 13,000, and then it came down to 10.
Wow.
Yeah.
So this is the jewel.
The jewel, but not too much longer. All right, so let me put this on back. Well, I could turn it on, but it's going to take a...
No, okay.
Yeah. Oh, Lord. Yeah. Okay. Whew. One reason why...
That was a transportable.
This was a portable, yeah, this supposedly, right?
Well, I remember interviewing the Dutch representative
Of this?
about
Of
this.
Panasonic?
Yeah, because they showed it at one of the shows in Amsterdam.
And you actually saw it back then?
Called for it was actually on display.
Oh my gosh.
And they originally made some for these millionaire yachts.
Yes,
in
exactly.
Cannes.
Again, supposedly portable, right?
Yeah. And it was indeed simply a showcase of what was possible.
All right, I'll come back in and handle that.
Okay.
All right, so back out here, now that we have clear sailing, turn the SW8 off. I've come new appreciation for the SW8. I sold one years ago, and then I just recently got this one. So that's the sickness about collecting, as you know, you steal something and then you still.
Yes. I want to go back.
All right, let me rip up the lights here again.
Okay.
The reason she has this, because she hates having the radios being visible,
Right.
and she does her videos here.
Okay,
Okay, so
right.
I catch my breath here. Should I go over these again anyway? Let's continue here. So
what's this radio?
this is called the Watkins Johnson 8718A MFP. That means multiprocessor front, multiprocessor front panel. And these are made for government and military use. High grade components in these receivers. Later years, Watkins Johnson, which is located just here, was located here in Gaithersburg, in Rockville, Maryland. Also, actually Gaithersburg, went to digital receivers. And if you compare the weight of this radio to the later receivers, like the the 8711A and the 1000. You'll notice that these things are heavier, and what that means is that these were more shielding in these receivers, and thus less subject to electric interference. But on this one, for example, if we go back to India, for example, as he says, 9445. So there's, this is the joy of shortwave listening here, as you know. So many of us have been hooked on these stations for so many years. And this one has readout to 1 hertz. So it also has what's called ISB, in addition to lower and upper sideband, which are smack on. I mean, these things are like atomic level stability. And it's got memory channels. And again, an example of the kind of technology that a lot of us always lusted after, but we could never get. Shall I move on?
Yeah.
So again, here's a second Drake R7A in the house. And this receiver was coupled with what's called the RV75. And the reason they made this was to add stability to the R7 receiver. These were basically not, the oscillators were a little unstable, so this is now hooked to this, and you actually don't tune it here, you tune it here. Right, and so that's the same station. This receiver was known, as you recall, for being super sensitive, and it was one of the top rated receivers. In the higher serial numbers, near 4,000, which are still rarely available, but you can find them, these receivers can still go for upwards of 2,500. So we're flipped down here. Right above that is another classic JRC, Japan Radio Company marine radio. This is one of the rarest there are, because JRC went from the NRD 93 series that we saw in the other room to what they call the NRD 300 series. They made something called the 301A. Don't ask me why they named it that. And then they had the 302A. And then briefly they had designed and produced, I think, for the Jordanian army or the Saudis, the NRD 630. I've never seen an NRD 630 on the used market. Never. But this one was from an owner who bought it and put it in his closet. So, just for example, we'll go down to the same station there. And this also has 1 hertz readout, which you can vary right there. 1 hertz. This is a basic but heavy-duty marine receiver, just like the NRD 93. These things are built like tanks.
And used in ships.
And used in ships. Right. And the problem is when you got a lot of the NRD 93 and others that were used on ships, they suffered from corrosion, salt air corrosion and things like that. And above that, this is another classic receiver from many years ago.
A McKay Dymac.
McKay Dymac. Long history, you can look it up, but I can't remember his first name. Mr. McKay decided to make high quality shortwave receivers in the form of stereo component.
Yeah.
What he did was, this is the 33C, which is one of the highest level made. The receivers were manufactured to go in your stereo equipment, so it would look nice and your wife wouldn't be angry at you, which is a problem I have here. But this is one of the highest quality radios still. And you'll notice I happen to have this tuned from the other day to a station. As I said, the amazing thing about the shortwave hobby is that today, as shortwave dies out, some stations either have come back or are still on the air. This is Guinea, Conakry in West Africa. And it was only a few years ago that this station had disappeared from shortwave, but now it's back. And you can see there, what can you say? Just beautiful music. I was listening to the station on the beach in Florida a few weeks ago, and it was just coming in beautifully, even better on another Sony radio. So the way this tunes is, for example, you've got your digits here, but very simply, you tune by digits. Of course, the importance of the dying trade that we have is that we have all these frequencies, as you know well, in our heads. So those of us who know this, but in 50 years from now, no one will remember these frequencies. Yeah. So if I want to go down to India, if I want to go up to Cuba, sorry, we go down to Cuba.
Frontera con México y que el
Give me another frequency. I'll go down to, let's see, since it's 530 here, let's go to the 6 megahertz band. Toronto, the last remaining Canadian shortwave frequency, or one of them. I think there's just maybe Newfoundland or something. And there's Arnie from Radio Havana,
Arnie Coro.
Arnie Coro from Radio Havana, right there on. Oh wait, I'm sorry. We're tuned to Toronto. I'm sorry, I made a mistake on that. But if it, I don't know why I thought. If we go down to, they're not on their usual frequency of 6,000 yet. So this is the McKay Dymec again. You can see they actually put real wood siding on these radios. And this one I got in absolute new condition, and the owner had put it in his closet, used it a few times. It is absolutely unscratched and unmarked.
Which I find amazing. I mean, a radio like that. I mean,
yeah,
I would be using it 24/7.
Absolutely. So I mean, there's WWV, which who knows how long we'll have that around. If you want to go up and down each band with this, you do have to switch these, and when you get to the next, you then have to switch up. Here's Cuba. We'll switch down. Let's say back to 11.6. You'll notice that this, I believe, I don't know whether this is India or Cuba. I think it's India, but at a much lower level than we used to hear India. Here's Argentina, which used to be there much more strongly because of propagation. We're not getting it much these days. A Brazilian station, 11765. Saudi Arabia. This does have filtering, by the way. Multiple filter selections. So you can get Saudi Arabia separated from that religious station at the, right above it.
Because they're operating on frequencies adjacent to each other.
That's right. And we'll just go check a few others. There's another Cuban frequency. I have no idea who that is. Could be Iran. 11800, again, testing my knowledge. Of course, these days with the internet, as opposed to old days when we had the World Radio Handbook, you can just get on the internet and put in the frequency, and people have put the international frequency guides there on the radio. We'll go up to 11.9. Saudi Arabia again. So on top, this is another pride and joy I have. I don't know if you know what this is. This is one of the last receivers produced in East Germany before the fall of the Berlin Wall. This is called it was EKD 515, and it was produced by the RFT company in East Germany. The factories for this company were knocked down a long time ago. It produced some of the last radios, and then the factory stayed around for a while. There are some photos on the internet of the factory itself. But this was the classic East German spy radio, I like to call it. It was used by the Stasi and embassies around the world. This weighs as much as that Panasonic. It's about 46 pounds. Heavy-duty metal construction. This one was found new in box.
And tubes?
All solid state.
All solid state.
And so let me walk around here, and I'm just going to turn this on because this operates on DC. I have not changed the voltage. And I have a heavy-duty DC converter in the back. And when I turn it on, you'll notice that it's like a thump and a buzz. So that's the DC current. I have a small speaker down here somewhere. So very complex radio to operate. It literally took me several months to figure it out, and all the guides for operation are on this little metal panel here.
But they're in German.
They're in not German, but there's mode, bandwidth, and gain control. So just to make it simple, if I want to go to India, I hit F for frequency, then hit 9445, and then execute. And then if I want to change the bandwidth on this, I hit B, and I hit 2, or hit B again, hit, let's say 5. And there are multiple bandwidths for this receiver. Here's the real amazing part of this. So there's a very wide bandwidth. If I want to lower it, I go 6. Now, for some reason, yeah, India has just signed off, so that's why we're not hearing them anymore. But I'll demonstrate for you. I'm going to go to Brazil. So you hear Brazil there. Let me demonstrate something for you. By the way, this has the same kind of decadic tuning as the Mackay dynamic. You have to do this. And some people have modified these radios to remove the detent, so it's just a constant knob that you have. I haven't had the courage to do that. So the thing that this radio has, and remember Sony came out with its famous 2010 receiver, whatever year that was. And
85, I think.
85.
Yeah.
And it had synchronous, amazing synchronous, still valued to this day as one of the amazing synchronous radios. This radio too has synchronous reception. So if you see that light right to the left of the S meter, that's the lock for the synchronous detector. Right? So if you also want to, for example, change the divisions of the tuning, you hit delta fine and let's say go to 1 and execute, and it goes 1 kilohertz tuning like so. I want to get out of that synchronous mode. I'm going to go to mode. So there's Saudi Arabia, but you see how tight these filters are on this thing. I mean, if I want to go down even further, I'll just go bandwidth 5. I can go down to bandwidth 4. I'm sorry, wrong one. Mode, bandwidth 4. You can see how tight that goes.
So it's a good radio.
It's an excellent radio. Superb. Absolutely superb.
Which is actually rather unusual because, I mean,
Yes.
a lot of the radios in East Germany are very poor quality.
Exactly.
Like the Trabants.
Exactly. Let me just get out of here because as you can see, I still have trouble figuring out how to do that radio. Again, this thing is built like a
tank.
Like a tank. Okay, so that's the tour here. I mean, the amazing thing is that there's been a resurgence with some of these classic radios, especially the Kenwoods. Okay, and with the audio quality, beautiful, top firing speaker, and the R2000, which actually I think has probably the best speaker ever put on any of these radios. Let me go to. These radios were limited in their selectivity, but listen to the sound on that thing. I mean, just it really is a bygone era, isn't it? I mean, when these things were produced just for a group of people like us who listen to these radios. And of course, again later on with the NRD 545, which was produced just for the shortwave listening market, from their marine, they went with receivers like this. But if you'll notice, in terms of technology, let me give you a good example of that. So we'll go down to India on this. Oh, sorry, India's not there. We'll go down to Greece. Again, in some years from now, we won't even be able to hear these stations. I'm sure they'll be gone for good. So there's what seems like a pretty good sound using this JRC receiver, and this is a $2,000 receiver. But if you go over here to another example of Drake's excellent a resurgence into the market, the R8 series. So we went from R7s to the R8 when the Drake came back. The audio from these Drake receivers was just so much fuller, and in fact was the one reason why many years ago I chose Drake over these JRC receivers. So let me give you a comparison. Now there's Greece. You can hear there's kind of a hiss. There's kind of a electronic hiss that you hear. But Drake, when they came out with the R8, and this is the original R8.
Can you see the same station?
Hear the difference, yeah. So again, I'm forgetting how to do it. Sorry, hold on. Try it again. You can hear the difference in that sound quality. Hello. I'll get vodka. She's bringing vodka down. This is what my wife has vodka when I'm using the radio. So.
No, I
Oh,
do
you want
it
me to
other
open
times
it?
too.
You want me to open it?
Yeah, but
Okay.
it's like a weird thing. I
What's
think
it?
it's a cork.
We'll go upstairs for this.
Yeah.
Oh, and I'll just so again you hear the difference in that audio.
Can you just do that bit again?
Okay, so
Do the comparison between the two radios.
okay, so here's on the same station. So I'll just tune a little bit, and you can hear that kind of. This was not known for what they call ultimate rejection for co-channel, but there's no interference here, so you can hear it. It initially sounds great, but and the speaker is basically the same up there, but listen to the difference here. And that is for a little speaker down there from this radio, which is a reason why the Drake R8, the original R8 before the A and the B, is now a more sought after radio. Also because they have heavier main tuning knobs and optical encoder. It's a little complicated. So while I love the later technology, this radio actually belonged to the famous DXer Don Jensen before he passed. I find myself still drawn to the Drake series for their quality, and I'll just leave out the other famous radio, which is this NRD 515, which actually shares design similarities with the other JRC radio. As you can see, it's got the megahertz switch here, just like this. So JRC, shared the technology between their receiver streams. So just for the hell of it, we'll go and check the audio on this on the same station. So I'll point out that the audio in this older 515 is actually better than this newer 545.
But still, the Drake is better.
I think the Drake is better if you. I agree with you. I think the Drake is still better. Now, just for the heck of it, if you have still battery time, I'm going to, even though there's no antenna connected, flip on this classic old Sony, and even with just the indoor antenna, this was known as a pre-selector radio, but you would hear it if the antenna was on, how sensitive these old Sonys were. You can't tell from that demonstration. Just comparing. Go down to 9420 on this. You hear the quality on that as well.
So how do you connect all these radios connected to the same antenna?
So I have a Dutch-made RF Systems DA8, which has 8 receivers from one Wellbrook antenna out front. There are more than 8 receivers here, so I jury rig it with coaxial adapters. I might as well show you these too, because I don't think, oh, did we already do these? Yeah, well, I can't power these on. This was the HQ180A X series, which had crystal selectors. You saw the 145 in the other room. This is kind of a pride and joy I have, because this Eddystone is actually a collector's group for Eddystone receivers in Britain. And these are just cherished radios because of the heavy-duty construction. This Eddystone actually weighs more than the HQ180. Not as much as an R390 or SP600, but just amazing metal construction.
And they're all tube sets, aren't they?
All tube sets, and of course this one has the original Eddystone speaker with it as well.
And these were used also in ships, weren't they?
These were also used in ships quite frequently, and of course you can tell the quality of this thing by the watch. Just give that a turn and you can see that that thing just keeps moving like that. So my next goal is to fire this thing up and...
So how did he turn an interest in broadcasting into a career at the Voice of America?
Well, that takes me way back. I literally goes back to the day when I was, maybe 8 or 9 years old, and there was an old radio in my aunt's house in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and I think it was a Blaupunkt with buttons and the names of all the European cities on it, and I was fascinated by it, especially by the feel of those buttons when they went down, changing your bands. And I started listening to those broadcasts. And, a few years later, I remember being in New York City on a family trip. And my father found my grandmother's old pilot radio, old wooden pilot radio with a big tuning eye in it, and brought it home with me. And he set a copper Radio Shack copper wire antenna in the attic in our home in Pennsylvania, and I was off to the races. I used to stay up hours and hours of each day, and the weekends were filled with what we call all-nighters. I used to stay up until 3 a.m. and get up at 6. And in the beginning, it was the attraction of the hunt. It really was, because I got involved with a few of the magazines, from the shortwave radio hobby, and I realized there were these things, QSL cards, that you could collect just because you heard a station, and reception report forms, and I think the competitive angle of it for me from the very start was interesting. Although I was also very interested in the cultural part of it, the fact that you could hear these stations, whether they were broadcasting to you or not, and hear them at quite amazing levels. And I quickly also started to listen to the major stations, Radio Moscow, Voice of America, ironically, where I ended up for years, Switzerland. Radio Netherlands was one of the first stations I heard with those wonderful interval signals, and really got into some of the content, especially from the Soviet and the Soviet bloc, countries. I remember, recording a lot of that in an old woolen sack reel-to-reel recorder, and sometimes during times of conflict in the world I would call the TV station in Philadelphia and tell them that I had just heard the latest news from about the Middle East war or major international events. So for me it was a mixture, but it really was, maybe I'm very different, but I was into the competitive nature of this. There really was a point when my thoughts turned to what this hobby could become for me, in a future career. My father had passed away I was a very young age, in 1972, and I started thinking about, college and what I would be doing to get out of this, small town outside of Philadelphia, and started to kind of make the first tentative approaches actually to the place I always wanted to work at, which was Voice of America. It's the only international broadcaster was at the time that the U.S. had, and started to make connections and ended up coming to Washington, to university here, to American University, and my focus was international affairs. And of course, as you know, shortwave listeners become experts in geography and experts in geopolitics, and that gave me a tremendous step up over competitors, because I literally walked into the VOA newsroom and I could name and write about every country in Africa and name their capitals, in 5 seconds, and most people couldn't do that.
And so, this is the late 70s?
Yeah, I wish I remembered the exact moment, but I had briefly interned for VOA in the summer of 1979. And that was when the old U.S. Information Agency existed, and the internship was actually a USIA internship. It wasn't the VOA internship. I can't tell you what I recall about walking into the building, but my first job as an intern was in the old Worldwide English, used to be called, in VOA. And that was on the second floor, I believe, of the VOA building down on the mall. And I really got a lesson in hardcore news coverage. I mean, and these people were a merry band of program producers and hosts and things like that, and they had very high standards. You had to have voice lessons, and they had former Marines who had deep voices, and if you didn't have quite the right voice, you would have to spend that much extra time getting there. They used to, back in the days, cut tape with razor blades on old Ampex machines, and we used to literally throw the metal reels across the room at the same time. It was quite an interesting experience.
And you were always involved in news?
Always in hard news. I did work in what they call the English features at one point. Some of the names I remember were Pat Gates and Phil. There's a Phil, I can't remember, it's not coming back to me, who was doing African shows, I think. Dick Strader was one of the African hosts at the time.
They had the breakfast show?
Show.
Phil Irwin, was it?
Phil Irwin. And I do remember, meeting some of these people because I had listened to them, on my shortwave radios. I also remember the day when I introduced digital shortwave radio receivers to the VOA people, because as you may or may not know, there were very few actual hardcore shortwave listeners who made the transition to international broadcasting. My friend Bill Whitaker was one, Kim Elliott was another, Dave Walcott, who went to Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, was another, but very few. And so I remember the day I walked in with a Panasonic RF 2800. People were amazed. Oh, there's digital readout, there's an LED readout on a radio. So I tried to kind of, integrate my fascination with the hobby into, being employed there. And a short while later, I did manage to latch on to part-time work in the Central VOA newsroom. And many people don't know this, but the head of the newsroom at the time was named Bernie Kamensky. He was a kind of a huge guy, walked with a cane. He went back to the 1940s, 50s with VOA, when VOA wasn't located in the Washington Mall. And Bernie was an old-style news guy, and he would whap your seat with his cane if he thought you had not worked hard on a story or done enough. And you'd hear that thwack of the cane, and you would say, "Oh, Bernie's here." And Bernie was also an avid shortwave listener. He had a McKay Dymec, which I have one up here, the same one actually. And I remember, and he had a Collins 51 J4 in his house. And so he was really probably my main mentor at VOA. And
And what did he teach you about journalism?
Bernie was known, and there was a New York Times editorial about him when he resigned from VOA, and that was at a time in later years under Ronald Reagan, when there was political pressure by the administration at the time for VOA to do more about Poland and have a sharper focused programming. He resigned on principle. I remember the day he stood up in the newsroom, stood up on a chair, as difficult as it was for him. And basically his message to everyone was, don't give up on your job or your standards. Always see the story through to the end. And those are, standards that I tried to take with me through my coverage, not only in Washington, but later years overseas.
But it must have been rather difficult. I mean, at one time you were the host of Nightline Africa. You also did excellent reporting out of Nairobi, for instance. And yet, during the same broadcast, you were there trying to tell the balanced story. And then there was this VOA editorial. Explain a little more about that.
Okay, so VOA editorials, and maybe you can help me with this because it's a little bit of a blank spot for me, but I think they got their beginning probably very early on. I don't know if it was the 50s or probably the 60s. And this was the way that the official policy of the whatever administration was in the White House at the time got out to worldwide listeners over VOA transmitters. The issue became very controversial over the years because you had this, again, this combination of VOA's news programming, which was supposed to be objective and accurate, and yet you had this injection of the official policy by way of these editorials, which I do believe at one point were called VOA editorials. In fact, I'm not sure whether in this internet age the page is still called VOA editorial or just editorials. And those were always prepared by what they call the Office of Policy.
So separate people.
Separate people. Well, they're not always separate people. They could have been regular VOA employees absconded, seconded to that Office of Policy.
But they couldn't work in both areas at the same time.
I don't recall, but it does raise questions, doesn't it? Because if someone goes back and forth, it's like a revolving door. But that office had obviously direct links and was influenced by and briefed by the State Department. Mm-hmm. And these were, the beginnings of what I call the tentacles of policy involvement. Were always there. I mean, let's face it, VOA was first on the air in the 1940s as a voice against Nazi Germany. They always said, we tell you the truth, but the fact of the matter is that the policy aspects have always been a foundation for the place, even up until today. The VOA charter still exists, but that's...
But it is a government agency. It's not a radio or television station, is it?
It is, in technical terms, it is now an internet and a TV station, if you want to put it that way, and still radio to whatever extent that's still going on in languages in English. But my views on this have changed over the years, and now that I am retired and gone from the place, the reality is it is a federal government agency. The VOA still now would not exist if it were not for the fact that Congress appropriates and spends money on it, and that is taxpayer money. And arguably here in 2017. As was the case in the 60s and 70s, people would say, hey, this is my money you're spending. I want the policies of my government outlined and explained over this thing called the Voice of America.
That sounds like propaganda.
Yeah. Well, very sensitive word, obviously, because it was always applied to Radio Moscow and Prague and East Germany. But
it implies that you're shouting across the border without really caring about some sort of feedback.
Well, and again, in the years when it was always just VOA, as you recall, and then Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. But as we got into the try to get these dates straight. Later on, in later decades, you had the formation of all these other voices under what became the Broadcasting Board of Governors, formerly USIA.
Radio Free Asia, Radio Marti.
First was Radio Marti, then it was TV Marti, then Radio Free Asia. And the question then became, well, wait a minute, what do they exist, why are they being created? And the reason, quite frankly, is they were created, and this is interesting, so stick with me. They were created because there was a sense and a notion and an assertion made that the Voice of America was not doing a good enough job or taking a sharp enough stance toward governments, dictatorial authoritarian governments that were still in power. Vietnam, Laos, China for Radio Free Asia, as I said, Cuba, Radio Marti. And so the question is, Were they propaganda? Well, they actually were, because in other words, they weren't created. There was a reason they were created, and that was to
So surrogate networks, weren't
they were surrogate networks, yes, to help and bring news as the lines go, unfettered and uncensored news to people who don't have access to them. Today the expression is to denied populations in denied areas of the world. But the fact of the matter is that in doing their job, in terms of the journalism involved, they were there to make trouble for the governments and to hasten the end of authoritarian governments. There's no question about it.
So what went wrong with U.S. international broadcasting?
That's
Put it this way: what should have happened to U.S. broadcasting?
well. I've often been accused of being biased because throughout my career I've always compared my product and the product that my colleagues at VOA put out to what I saw as the major competitors. And as you know, in those years the major competitors were the BBC, and in many respects some of the smaller stations like Radio Netherlands that had fairly robust news operations, and actually on the ground in some of the places that I served in overseas were covering the news better than I was. Radio France International in Africa, Deutsche Welle as well, also in Africa and in Asia. So it was always obvious to me that we had competition. Let me roll back a little bit. The Berlin Wall came down, the Soviet Union collapsed. And there were a couple of decades there when people were saying, what does VOA, what do these people exist for anymore? And looking back, there are obvious reasons why they should still have existed through the 80s and the 90s and into the 2000s actually, which was that there were some countries that were still having big problems. Former Soviet satellites, countries in the Balkan, former Balkan countries. Where I think things got rocky for U.S. international media was that there wasn't enough forward-looking approach to how to dominate the global market, the global audience. And what happened was that the BBC remained very much, we talk about the BBC World Service, so its strengths remained in radio and international coverage and continued to improve. Whereas the VOA, under U.S. international media started to suffer some cutbacks, not under Reagan, of course, because he added a lot of money to the budget. But there wasn't the same, as I say, kind of aggressive forward-looking approach to trying to predict where things were going to go. Now, that said, VOA and its news operation it was one of the first on the internet with a website. It was kind of rudimentary back then, and people always remind me, well, wait a minute, VOA was first in doing some of this, but VOA never took hold, for example, and got into television, aggressive global TV, like the BBC did, and like some other countries did.
It treated it as a project. They had WorldNet, didn't it?
That's right. It started as WorldNet, which was very political. It was under the old U.S. Information Agency. But they just never got going. And what we have today is a situation where VOA does not really have a huge global TV audience. It's not on the air 24/7. If you go to a hotel room, if you're in Pakistan or in India, when I traveled with President Obama, I checked the TV channels. You basically couldn't, you didn't know that VOA existed anywhere. What happened was that a lot of the pieces under the BBG started to form. They formed a radio diwa, for areas of Pakistan, and they started to chop it up into even more pieces under the BBG.
I can hear music in the background. What are we listening to?
Well, you're going to bank your camera down. This is.
No, of course it stopped.
Yeah, of course it stopped, but actually the station is still on the air. That is Guinea, Conakry, Guinea, in West Africa. Amazingly, on shortwave. On shortwave, of course, they have a pause in their programming here for some reason. But if you go, down here, you can hear Greece, which at one point turned itself off. Greece was having budgetary problems. Greece is back on the air, supposedly for Greek shippers, Greek Navy people or whatever. So it's an interesting example, isn't it, of, even in 2017, some of these stations have come back, they shut off, they came back, and, I often say to people, going back to the old hobby of shortwave listening, some of the stations that we always wanted to listen to but were the most difficult are kind of now right there for you,
Right, tell me a bit more about the BBG, because that came much later. The Broadcasting Board of Governors.
Right, the worst possible name for a media conglomeration ever chosen. The Broadcasting Board of Governors was formed in the late 90s when, under President Bill Clinton, a Democrat, they decided to disband the old U.S. Information Agency. And the BBG was created to be an independent agency to manage all of the U.S. international broadcasters. Again, one of the worst possible names you could choose, because for most Americans that means absolutely nothing.
And what did it do?
Well, it came in and as a 9-member board with the Secretary of State serving as in an ex officio fashion, which means, again, remember, you had that policy influence at the upper levels, and policy influence at the upper levels always trickles down to the lower levels, no matter what people tell you. So, the BBG came in, and in my view, it created kind of what I like to call a star chamber. It's not the exact definition, but employees hardly ever met these people. You sometimes didn't know that they were holding their meetings. Their meetings were always actually in the beginning not public. Now at least they're on the internet, at least the public parts of them are. Some of them are declared, some parts of those meetings are national security declared, so you can't find out about them without a Freedom of Information request. So, it became very bureaucratic and a kind of a very anonymous kind of control over news people who were doing their jobs, working 24/7 and working hard.
So what should have changed, and what did you do to try and change it?
Well, in terms of the White House coverage?
And also the direction the VOA was going in under the BBG.
Well, I don't think there was a way to affect the general direction of the organization. I think some years ago it set out on a path where they became focused on audience numbers, or what they claimed were their audience numbers, on the number of views or hits or clicks that they could claim they could detect on certain web stories on the internet. It was quite frustrating, because many times I would write a story at the White House, for example, having in later years been based on a briefing on information that you could only get at the White House. And that story would be going into the VOA newsroom and would be rewritten, as much as usually happens with a newspaper story. And they would add this and this and this and this. And sometimes they wouldn't even have our byline on the story. And so the advantage of having your own correspondent with their own instincts and their own decades built up levels of news judgment was gradually decreased. And it was a major frustration. And I'll always remember the one of the pivotal moments for me, actually in the first year I was there, was we had a story about the Palestinian issue, and it dominated the White House briefing. And the producer called up, editor-producer called up from the newsroom and said, "We don't want you to file on that." And I said, "Well, I'd already assigned my number 2 to file that story, so I could be freed up for something else." And she said, "Nope, we don't want that today." And that was kind of when it hit me that kind of a switch went off, that this place was changing and not for the better. So
you started on the path towards retirement, didn't you?
Well, by 2013, that had become, it had become quite frustrating. I felt that even though I was White House correspondent, in many ways I was there only in name. You combine the treatment from the White House itself in terms of questions and access with the hassles of essentially what was becoming a very dysfunctional VOA newsroom, with staff reductions, morale crisis, and many would argue mission oblivion, because they had lost track of what they were supposed to be doing. that kind of, at one point, you decide that you don't want to end up dead on the floor like one of our colleagues ended up at one point, because
What do you mean by that?
well, some people, the frustrations of dealing with the VOA dysfunctions and the bureaucracy and the infighting and the battles.
Of course, health problems.
Health problems.
Okay.
Yeah, especially when the internet came, because that became such a focus of management that those who were tasked to deal with it, so often with equipment or computers that weren't high-powered enough to handle the system, the CMS, which, by the way, was still in Prague. The CMS was located based in Prague, where RFVRL was, not in Washington.
This is the content management system.
That's right. And constant breakdowns, constant mistakes, spelling errors in VOA material and your own material. You constantly had to call them. If you weren't checking your own stories a couple hours after you filed them, you were asking for trouble.
Well, so when do you think the heyday was of the VOA? When did it have its most influence?
Well, I would have to, you have to point back to, the days of the Cold War. Clearly, I mean, I only got there in 1979, but I think
But
that...
are you actually being fair to yourself? Yes, obviously the Cold War, but I remember listening to Nightline Africa and those sort of programs, certainly in the 80s. You certainly understood the audience and
Thank you.
The type of interaction and the programming. Bear in mind, there was no internet. Very difficult for people to actually interact as they can today,
That's right.
either through mobile or through the web.
Yeah.
And yet it seemed that it was a friendlier voice. In fact, it wasn't a voice of America. It was voices from America.
That's an interesting observation. Yeah, I mean, again, 1980s. When I was overseas, personally, for me, the most rewarding part was when I was away from the VOA headquarters. You'll hear a lot of people say that they basically want to stay away from the central headquarters, and I think that's something you observe with other news organizations.
Definitely, yeah.
But the most rewarding period in my life, if that's what you're asking, was when I was out on the ground covering stories, interviewing Aung San Suu Kyi in Burma, or covering the coup in Sudan or Uganda. That's when you really feel like you're doing your best work. As far as your question more broadly was the heyday of VOA. I don't know whether you can really pinpoint it, but I know that it certainly hasn't been since 2000 or 2005. I think the best times really ended in the late 90s, probably.
And yet, if you look at the official figures, I mean, they seem to be going up all the time.
Well, that's a controversial issue, and it's one that I've been trying to point out to people, is that even though the Broadcasting Board of Governors, with its research arm and its $50 million contract with the Gallup organization, they claim increasing figures. The latest, for example, as we speak, was a 50 million increase in audience over the last year in 2016. 50 million. Keep in mind that when the BBG or VOA, when they sign new affiliate agreements with various stations, which has also been a very important focus for them, right, it's always sunny in Philadelphia when it comes to the numbers. So the numbers were always going up. Of course, the BBC played this game over the years, but somehow I have more confidence in, maybe you disagree with the way other broadcasters measure their audience. 50 million increase is what VOA claimed in the last year. Keep in mind that it's become a standard practice for this agency to sign affiliate agreements with stations in Nigeria or wherever, and then instantly take on that claim number of audience figure for that particular station and tack that on. I remember seeing the former director of VOA, who I won't name here, addressing some foreign service retirees in Washington, and he referred to this new agreement in Nigeria, and he said, well, and we have 6 or whatever million new viewers or audience. And I was shaking my head in the audience. I said, how do you know that? So I personally don't believe the audience figures. I'm not alone in that. BBC recently, came to a massive expansion, several $100 million worth, where they're going to have production facilities in various countries, and they're on the road to what they want, a 500 million audience figure by the year, into the 2020 or 2025. whatever it is. I think, it's just my opinion that this is a way for the BBG and VOA to, curry favor on Capitol Hill and, be assured of a permanent existence. Yeah.
Right, we're now under a new administration, the Trump administration. What do you think they will do?
Well, let's look back at what happened under Reagan. Reagan appointed his Hollywood friend Charlie Wick to head the U.S. Information Agency. You then had things happen like the Let Poland Be Poland TV special on the World Network. If Donald Trump treats the Broadcasting Board of Governors, which may not be named that, forever, because the BBG has now been downgraded to an advisory role. If he treats this agency like he did the FCC, where he inserts his own person there, or with the Department of Defense, where he inserts his person there, there would be big changes. Of course, the difference with the U.S. international media is that they're supposed to be independent. They're supposed to have a journalistic firewall, which, by the way, has never been a solid firewall because, as everyone knows, policy always, as I said, always trickles down from the top, and it can trickle way down to the bottom.
So is the VOA editorial charter, is it void when inconvenient?
Interesting way to put it. The example I give recently was the formation of what they call their extremism watch desk, and that happened under President Obama. And this became a subject of a lot of tension within VOA. At one point there was scheduled what they called a BBG retreat on violent extremism. And it had participants from VOA, it had participants from the agency, participants from the State Department. And none of the rank and file knew that this was happening. It was sponsored, by the way, by a right-wing conservative think tank in Washington, the Hudson Institute. And ironically, as we speak, the new acting chairman of the Board of Governors is the head of that very institute. So you have to ask yourself the question, why did that extremism watch desk, it was created at VOA, it was staffed up, and it's now on the front page of VOA's global website.
What is it trying to do?
It's trying to increase the number of stories and the content that cover the issue of violent extremism in the Islamic world, and they sure do stick them up there on the website. But the question is, where did the impetus for something like that come from? It clearly didn't come from within the building. There clearly was administration pressure under Obama to have that happen.
But is that a bad thing?
Not necessarily a bad thing, as the current director, again as we speak, said, and she's has a Washington Post and other newspaper background. There are times when some of the newspapers, this is a case she makes, some of the newspapers accepted funding from car companies to put up special sections or series of stories reporting on the auto industry. But some people are very comfortable with equating that kind of thing to this extremism issue and just basically justifying that, because again,
it's a sort of VOA editorial or advertorial with a different brand.
That's right. And that wasn't the only time. I mean, even again under President Obama. Remember, it was Bill Clinton who dissolved the USIA. But under President Obama, at one of the Board of Governors meetings, they had Ben Rhodes, who was President Obama's foreign policy advisor, video conference into the board meeting, and lament very, very specifically to all the board members of how he felt that agency wasn't doing a good enough job countering violent extremism and Russian disinformation. So you see, since then, there's been a pattern of an increase, an uptick in that kind of coverage. And here's the point. The only way you can find out about this is to file Freedom of Information Act requests to the government agency. And it's then up to them to determine what kind of email traffic or other things they issue in response to that request. This kind of gets into one other area, which is increasingly what the Board of Governors has been doing, is basically they've been turning BBG and VOA into a training center. Much like USAID, where they will send people out from Washington and help journalists, local journalists on the ground in these denied areas, up up the level of their own reporting. Sometimes at great risk, by the way, because these people are often in places that they can get injured or killed or imprisoned because of what they're doing. Although I would make the case that I'm not sure that's the role of this agency. There are other non-government organizations that can do that kind of thing. I'm not quite sure to what extent the BBC does the same thing or other media organizations do. But it's always been my view that the VOA and this agency should stick to what it does, which is reports about the United States and tries to explain what's going on in here. Difficult. It will be more difficult to do that under Donald Trump, I think. So it's a tough issue. It really is.
So what do you think should happen?
Well,
Or put it this way, what's your preferred future? What would be the ideal situation? Because it's still costing, was it over $700 million?
it's $777 million in 2017 for the entire agency and $224 million for VOA itself. I think from our conversations. I mean, I've come to a different place than most people who leave VOA, despite all the good things I've been able to do there. I do not think, from a taxpayer standpoint, that this country is in a stage when, if people really knew that this place still existed, that they would renew it. I'm not convinced that, given the performance problems that we've seen in this agency to date, that it necessarily deserves to continue to exist in perpetuity. There are members of Congress who are utterly fed up with the morale and efficiency issues that they've seen over time.
Because it's always on the bottom of the list, isn't it?
It's always at the bottom of the list. You almost never hear or see hearings about U.S. international broadcasting. You never hear or see rank and file journalists appear in these hearings. It's always the experts, the think tank people. And so, again, I've come to a very different place, as hard as that's been for me since I retired, because I've been accused of being a hypocrite. How can you have enjoyed this government career and now be saying these things? But that's where I am. I honestly, because primarily I don't believe the audience figures that they put out, I honestly think this is a primary example, and I've told people who are in influential positions this. I honestly feel it's a primary example of a government agency that should have probably been downsized significantly many, many years ago, and or closed completely. And that's the big one that people can't get over.
So was the best thing to do to bring VOA and RFERL and all the other entities together and run it a bit like the BBC World Service?
Well, I think the creation of what was called the cacophony of voices under the board was a major mistake. I do agree in some ways with one of our former colleagues who we know well, a former shortwave listener, who has made the point that was not a positive thing, the fracturing of the U.S. international broadcasting, structure. And I think it, among other things, made it difficult for any average American to understand what the hell it is their government has been doing with their taxpayer money when it comes to outreach overseas. So I think that was a major mistake.
It's also rather interesting that VOA spent a lot of time focusing on radio.
Yes.
Did it not make a transition to other platforms fast enough? In other words, visual storytelling.
Well, the answer is yes. I'm a little torn on that because I'm an old radio reporter. There are people today who insist that radio still plays a major role, and indeed shortwave transmission should have a resurgence. I'm not necessarily sure I agree with that, despite the fact that behind me are about 15 shortwave radios, which I like to listen to. But the reality is that shortwave is going to be permanently gone. As hurtful as that is for me to say, they're claiming now, agency officials at this point, that they're about to announce a resurgence of English broadcasting by VOA. That was almost completely destroyed in recent years as this focus on the internet, intensified, and the focus especially on TV for the internet. which they didn't have the resources for. Well, I'll like to see it when it comes, and what they propose in terms of this rebirth of English as the lingua franca of the world, supposedly the rebirth of English broadcasting by VOA. Whether that will see a return of some of the excellent programs you and I knew, of the programs that VOA used to have for the Caribbean, the programs that used to be highly respected, where they had kind of like BBC NewsHour and the others. I don't know. I don't think they can ever catch up to the quality that the BBC has managed to achieve. BBC has managed to extend itself not only on the internet but globally on television.
And what else has the government done in order to try and influence overseas listeners? Because I mean, didn't something happen in the State Department?
Well, that's kind of the side story here, because as the situation in Iraq deteriorated and we saw the rise of ISIS, you had these very, very kind of use the word shady or very interesting little operations begun by the Pentagon. The State Department began a counter-ISIS campaign, which really wasn't very successful. There are plenty of articles in the New York Times and Washington Post about this. It was not very successful at all. How many of these are going on still today? I'm sure that many of them are. The irony was that at a time when the Obama administration was treating VOA and the Board of Governors quite justifiably, because of the inefficiencies there, as pariahs, they were also negotiating with Hollywood moguls and tech companies in Silicon Valley and lobbying them to try to take a stronger private sector role in the counter-ISIS and counter-Russian disinformation campaign. So, that's what you saw under Obama. And it's hard to know what Hillary Clinton would have done if she had been elected. I'm afraid that if she had been elected president, she would have been kind of taken in by the same kind of internal propaganda and easy lines that you hear from some of the managers in this agency, and pretty much let them continue doing business as usual, instead of coming in and making wholesale changes and having a thorough clean out of the agency and trying new leadership. Whether Donald Trump will do that remains to be seen.
But what did Barack Obama do towards the end of his administration, his second term? He changed the law around BBG, didn't he?
Over the years, since about 2008, 9, 10, and up to present day, the U.S. Congress became increasingly disaffected and disgusted with the state of affairs in the Broadcasting Board of Governors. There were scandals, there were lawsuits. At one point, the agency was faced with a $400 million lawsuit by private contractors who were not being paid properly. And this all kind of bubbled up to the top. And at one point on Capitol Hill, a bipartisan group of congressmen got together, led by the Republican Ed Royce, but also with participation from Democrats. And they drew up legislation for major restructuring of the BBG. This caused all kinds of, panic, of course, in Voice of America and in the agency, because they felt that Congress was mishandling this restructuring. It's impossible to go through the legislation now, but eventually the legislation got to a vote in the House of Representatives and passed unanimously on a voice vote. It was then blocked from a vote in the U.S. Senate, which would have sent it to President Obama's desk, because of direct lobbying of Congress by members of the Broadcasting Board of Governors and probably VOA officials as well. So the legislation finally died, but not completely, because two members of Congress, one of them was Mac Thornberry, started to develop legislation for what was called a Global Engagement Center, and to counter Russian disinformation and all this. And they put out their own bill. And as time ran out on Barack Obama, what happened was that even though that larger legislation died in Congress, this little piece of new legislation still had legs. And it found itself it found its way into what's called the Defense Authorization Bill. So what you have is that bill basically has reduced the BBG to an advisory role, and foresees the creation of what's called the International Broadcasting Advisory Board, IBAB. And members of that board are supposed to be selected by the president, but also from both sides of the aisle in Congress, minority and majority. It's supposed to be a 5-member board, but let's remember, on that board will be the Secretary of State of the United States. So while the board remaining members will be serving out their terms, eventually this legislation also embedded a permanent CEO. John Lansing, at this point, was the CEO selected, under Obama, and he will remain unless Donald Trump replaces him. So, by the time people see this interview, there may have been changes. The question really is, in my view, again, goes back to the fact that this is a federal agency. Now, they're all talking about how the VOA charter and the firewall against political interference will remain. But in my view, U.S. taxpayers really no longer have the patience to fund this kind of operation at the level it is.
So who would care if VOA and all those broadcasters went away?
In my view, it's like the story about if the tree falls in the woods. I don't believe that there would be any major earthquake around the world among global audiences if VOA disappeared tomorrow.
Okay, and put it the other way around. Is there a need for a voice? In other words, is there a need for an agency or a station or a media organization that is telling America's story?
Well, let's look at this, point blank. Today, with the internet and with mobile and social media, you have local radio stations, you have the Defense Department, you have the White House, you have C-SPAN, which is a global broadcaster on its own, even the local station here in Washington, WTOP. All of these have people working for them. It's my position that this country no longer really needs a civil servant force funded currently at the $224 million level that will somehow be able, in any higher ways than you can get anywhere else from these other sources, to somehow explain the policies, foreign policy and domestic ups and downs of this country. People can tune into, the White House feed under Trump. They can tune into the Defense Department. They can tune into Congress itself via C-SPAN, and not to mention CNN and the other networks. That's just my view. I don't think that this, as a taxpayer spending issue, that this country really needs that kind of a force anymore.
Okay, and you have also a situation, especially under Obama, where it looked as though there was a shift away from the idea of producing content and broadcasting it into a particular target area in order to influence and give voices to the voiceless, as it were. A shift away from broadcasting content, saying, no, we will provide networks. In other words, we'll, in some cases,
training.
Training. We'll fly over the country sometimes and create Wi-Fi networks so the rebels can tell their own story.
Right. Well, again, I mean, that's the direction that was signaled in this agency some years ago. Always remember that one of the board members came into the newsroom, very risky thing to do for members of the board, and started basically telling news people that they shouldn't be doing their reporting job as intensely as they always had thought they should be doing it. They should just let AP or Reuters or Agence France Presse and run those stories, and come up with these more contextual, backgrounded reports, and that was a better way to spend money. And also made the case that, again, increasingly the role of VOA and the agency would be to train these people, these local journalists in denied areas, to do their own work. Well, again, you don't need a $777 million agency to do that kind of thing. It can be done, for much less money, with a much smaller workforce.
And isn't that what's happening now with this PeaceNet? operation?
It's quite possible, and again, you've seen the rise of these, non-government organizations getting into that area, and many of my colleagues, former colleagues, agree that if that's, that those organizations exist for those kinds of projects. It doesn't have to be done by the Voice of America, and so I think what's happened is we've gotten to a point where VOA is desperately clinging on to both what it was. You can see that from the people who are, even today, waxing, wonderfully about the old days of Willis Conover and the effect that jazz had, on the Iron Curtain, but also, trying to grasp on to anything. Some of my friends say basically throwing spaghetti against the wall and seeing if it sticks.
My name is Willis Conover.
This voice was amazing.
Willis Conover speaking.
A very soft baritone.
The Voice of America Jazz Hour.
And commanding at the same time.
Lester Young in Washington, D.C., 1956.
Commanding you to listen, which I did.
On the night of December 7th,
This is how I was introduced to jazz back in Moscow, Russia.
Lenses performed.
He was very particular about all of the things that were recorded in the studio. Make one mistake, hear a pop on the tape, because we were using vinyl, not CDs at the time, and we would have to start all over.
And one day I was working on a show for him. It was 150 pops that I had to edit. Not electronic editing. Back in the 70s, it was old-fashioned editing with the razor blade and the tape. It took me like 3 hours to do a half-hour show.
How long the U.S. Congress will have patience for that, I don't know.
So finally, are you disappointed? Are you sad? Or how do you look back on it? I mean, it wasn't all bad.
Wasn't all bad. And again, I'm glad that I was able to be a part of the history of the world first during the times that I was, able to cover the news, and I'm grateful to an extent to VOA for enabling that, those experiences. And I'm sad primarily that VOA itself was not able to grasp onto the opportunities that existed to become more competitive in terms of on a global level. I always, quote someone, it was a VOA official who, I think in a weak moment said to me, he said, VOA long ago lost the opportunity to become a global destination of choice for audiences. You can argue with that here and there. You can say, well, people in Swahili-speaking areas are still listening, or they're looking at our mobile app, or people in some areas in Asia and Burma, for example, it's still important there. But I think the reality is that there's a lot of truth in that. There were some key opportunities missed along the way, and that's where I feel sad for the organization. People like myself who worked there, spent many years of our lives, our entire lives, their professional lives, will never regret what we did. The risks that we took in many cases, in covering the news. So, yeah, I'm a little wistful about it. But, at a certain point, you take a position and you stand on it, and that's my position at this point. It's disappointing and frustrating as it is for some of my current and former colleagues there. That's the place where I've come to.
So you've retired. Will you be doing more listening?
Well, let's see.
You've got the receivers.
To the chagrin of my wife Harriet, still have probably 3 dozen radios in this house. I'm going to have to get them out of here, and bit by bit, I'll keep a few of my classics around. Maybe in 20 years, when there's nothing left on shortwave, I'll be grasping that portable radio and still searching.
But in the meantime, there are still some stations. Maybe you can turn it up. It's
Yeah.
9420.
Yeah, well, that's okay. Let's take a quick tour. So we're in 31 meters, lower part of it, and this is some of the stations that are still around. We have, if you want to turn it up a little bit.
Yeah.
So we have Greece, which, as I said, amazingly came back from the dead. There was a BBC frequency, but nothing there now. If we go up a little further, not sure what that is. It might be a Cuban frequency. There, of course, is China Radio International, which, as you know, has become a juggernaut in terms of media, although there may be some changes coming on that as well. If we go here, interestingly, in the days of crowded shortwave bands, you couldn't hear many of these weaker stations. This is a station in Brazil on 9665 that comes in very well now, that in the 70s or 80s you wouldn't be able to hear because it was drowned out by VOA in Moscow and others. And if we go up a little further, let's see what we got. There's there. So it's not as if things have completely disappeared from shortwave. There's another Greece frequency. So there's a lot to listen to there. It's a good example, and some days, strangely to many people, I'll be listening to Zanzibar, which is still on the air. Sudan was still on the air recently. It might have gone off, or these Brazilian stations, and of course Guinea, which was there earlier when we started the interview. So there you go. The help of a stringer in Jakarta, and we both went in. I remember the distinct feeling of, surveillance, of being watched. At the time, I did get to interview Archbishop Bello, who later got the Nobel Prize. And there was one moment when we went into a restaurant, and we were there, myself and a few other journalists. And we got in the restaurant, and there were all these guys in the back of the restaurant at the other tables, but they all had walkie-talkies. They all had the little rubber ducky antenna walkie-talkies, and they monitored us, throughout, and even just walking in Dili, you were under surveillance. I had some other experiences like that. In Ethiopia, I was faced off by a soldier with an AK-47 because he felt I had taken a picture of I thought it was a ditch, but apparently there was a military placement in the area. Going into Uganda after the coup that overthrew Obote, having to go through 4 or 5 checkpoints and hand out cigarettes to kids with guns on the way in. And I covered the coup in Sudan that overthrew Numeri. I happened to be there when that happened, and I remember being there with Robert Kaplan, who's a very well-known author now, his books about the developing world. And we were in the hotel in the Meridian and came downstairs, and the tear gas hit us tear gas hit us in the face as we went down the elevator. And I remember having to smuggle out, get my VOA report out on a cassette, having it flown out with someone. Never found out whether it got on the air, because by the time it got anywhere, it was probably overtaken by vets. And of course, in Bangkok, I covered the the upheaval in 1991 involving the military, the famous scene of the army general kneeling before the king, and probably one of the high points also was covering Burma and the whole military government versus democracy movement, and finally, as I said, interviewing Aung San Suu Kyi in 1995, who I think is a Gandhi-like figure, although she'd been having some problems, even now with the government, even after the momentous changes there. So, a lot of good experiences, a lot of fun experiences too. We got to visit Zanzibar at a time when it was still kind of looked like it was the hotels were stamped in East Germany, and there were air conditioners hanging out, and went into the middle of the Congo, into Kisangani, and stayed in godforsaken places in Somalia and Hargeisa and places that I always had actually listened to on the radio. So for me, the combination of my hobby and the professional life was quite extraordinary. But as I'm sure you'll acknowledge, the challenge now is what do I do now? I started listening after the old 1940s radio that we saw. I started listening on HQ 180s. So these have a very special place in my heart. I heard most of the countries that I heard as a shortwave listener on these receivers. They could wake themselves up with this clock. It's an auto turn on. So if you wanted to listen to a station, and you turn it on an hour before, so the drift decreases, and you wouldn't have that problem.
And likewise, looking at that dial, that's a 24-hour clock, isn't it?
That's right. This is the famous Telechron clock, which you also see on the HQ 100. Mm-hmm. And again, these are rarely available. Sometimes they're found new in box still at this late time. But again, it's a 24-hour clock, and it was linked to a kind of an auto and a standby mode here. But this receiver, I often said that the first receiver to duplicate what the HQ 180 had in terms of tuning tools was, help me out here, probably the NRD 515. That's the comparison I made. Because on the old Hammerlands you had 4 positions of selectivity, lower sidebands. You had a extreme fine tuning Werner control. You had the notch filter, and you had multiple AGC positions plus the antenna tune. So I mean, these receivers are still sought after, and highly prized by people.
And where would you find these sort of receivers now? I mean, Dayton Hamvention?
Yeah, Hamfests. I mean, interestingly, you can still find these radios. A lot of them at Hamfest, which amazingly are still going on, even though they're a little depressing these days because you go there and.
It's a museum.
It's a museum, and the people are a museum too. But there are a few, this is the interesting part of the hobby these days, there are a few people who still completely refurbish receivers like this. One of them, whose name is Howard Mills, lives in West Virginia, and his entire bottom of his house is filled with mostly Collins and Hammerland and R390 and other receivers, and he completely takes them apart, strips the face down, sandblasts the panel, and you can have him do a job like that. It might take up to a year to do, but you get back a completely refurbished radio, these are just beautiful radios. The tragedy is that, again, when you and I are no longer here in some decades, I hate to see where these things end up. Yeah, hate to see where those end up. So okay. That's the tour. Wow. And I might as well show you the one more, which is this is another classic. Which
that says the one more thing.
Yeah, the one more thing, like Steve Jobs. This just arrived the other day, and this is another heavy radio. The classic Raquel 6790 GM.
Okay.
And I'll turn that around for you. This one was worked on by one of those persons I just mentioned who lives in Upper Maryland. Initially worked on to replace the LED backlights. And this is a very low frequency receiver which goes down to, I think, 1 hertz. Or something.
Basically DC to daylight.
Yes. Unfortunately came with these bent. So I have to now figure out how to replace these rack handles. But this is also one that was made like the Watkins Johnson for military and professional use. And I'll be taking this up in 3 days to a little cabin in Pennsylvania where we're going to have, it's called French Creek. And 3 or 4 or 5 guys are going to be tuning around radios for 2 days.
Really?
Yeah.
So the expeditions continue.
The expedition continues.
And that's all for now. But there are more in-depth interviews to come as the new Media Network safaris continue. Please subscribe to this channel, and remember, we're always interested in your feedback. For the moment, back soon. Bye for now.